But let me jump in right away because we have so much exciting stuff to cover. I'm really honored to introduce the Bocks this morning as our keynote speakers. I think it's a real coup to have them here and to really discuss with us their research and their perspective. So right away, let me get to introducing Carl and Jane Bock. Who wants to go first?
Good morning. My half of the talk is going to be about history of the Research Ranch and how it came to be. It's edifying to me to look back over the history and to understand how science gets started and how it has pitfalls and how it gets back on track. In 1968, Ariel Appleton, with the support of her family, decided to create the Research Ranch Foundation. Its purpose was to see what would happen if all livestock were removed from the 3,000 plus hectares that make up where you are now. And some people were really shocked and said it was a bad idea and predicted what would happen. I remember someone saying, why, it's going to take about 3 years and you're going to see nothing but shrubs everywhere. It's not going to be a fit place. Someone else said, God will set fires on this place because this grass was created for cattle. And so those were the negatives. But interestingly enough, our neighboring ranchers were more supportive. In fact, one of those ranchers who was a well-known conservative, in fact, he was one of the 3 founding members of the John Birch Society in Arizona, said, "Oh, Mrs. Appleton, this is about conservation, huh?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I'm a very conservative man. I like your idea." And from that day to this, those same ranching families and a good many more have been wonderful to us. So her opinion was to stop all manipulations. Now that goes against the grain of all kinds of people, like research scientists, like people that have the word manage or management in their degree or in their job description, not manage. Oh. And also it goes against how we're organized in this country, and that is we're big on 3-year plans and 3-year research grants and 5-year plans, and this is a plan into the foreseeable future. That's pretty scary too. It doesn't fit anybody's 3-year plan. The Appletons wisely set up a research grant right off the bat, quite a bit of money, their own money, so they could attract great scientists. Well, they got one great scientist, maybe he was great. He quickly spent all that money, brought a whole bunch of students down here, visited once or twice himself, spent all the money in 1 year, and that was that. That was an uphill learning curve for the Appletons. After that, they said, well, if we're going to have these nutty academics hanging around here, they better bring their own money. And that has been the policy from then until now. It's obvious to anybody that if she's had this idea, you have to monitor. You have to keep track of those changes through time. And there are all kinds of ways to monitor. And you could just sit here and fortunately, one of the great things that happened, a family friend named Ray Turner came out here right at the inception of the ranch, set up a whole bunch of photographic sites, and those continue down to the present time. And those are invaluable, as you know, for those of you that are familiar with the Changing Mile. But it became obvious also that if you're going to monitor here, maybe you should monitor somewhere else as well. And those wonderful neighbors said, sure, if you're going to measure whatever there, come on over here, it's okay, as long as you don't destroy anything. And that was part of the monitoring agreement with the Appletons, was that it was non-destructive monitoring. Very early, okay, the cattle left in '68. About 1971, Ron Pulliam started coming here. He was a professor at the University of Arizona, and his work on niche partitioning of birds, that simply how are the grassland resources balanced out by numbers of species, well over 24 species of grassland birds. He did that study and a study on carpenter ants that really set the stage. This work is still quoted today and actually has inspired research all over the world. It was truly a monumental time in ecological research. We showed up in 1972, came back in 73 and started research, and were serious about research from 1974 for over 3 decades. And monitoring can be done in 2 ways. One kind I've named horizontal. Let me explain what I mean. That means you take a grass line like this and you compare it with places as similar in terms of environmental conditions as you can find, and you sample many, many different places, and you draw conclusions about grasslands from this place and time and nearby. That's the sort of stuff you do for a thesis or a 3-year project. The other kind, the ecological literature calls longitudinal research. That's horizontal and longitudinal don't match. I like to call it vertical research, in which you study one place through time. That's fairly rare. When it is done, often it's 5 acres, or we had a wonderful 30 years ago tour of the Santa Rita experiment station, and on those thousands of acres, the director at that time knew of 1 acre that hadn't been twiddled with. And by twiddled with, I mean burned, grazed, then burned, plowed, then planted, plowed, then left alone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We started off looking at the things we knew. We set up permanent study plots on the North Mesa and the East Mesa. And this was before GPS. We used rebar and grape stakes and a can of spray paint. And not too long after that, we set up more permanent plots on Bald Hill and Lyle Canyon. I'm pleased to say that all of those are now GPS locations, but in the beginning they weren't. And by the way, Carl and Bock and I have had a 20-year fight about the setup in Lyle Canyon. It's because I did it. So we started monitoring grasses and birds on those places, quickly followed by small mammal live trapping. And we did that often on this place and the Jelks properties and the Baba Kamari. Later, Carl added grasshoppers because of our acquaintanceship with and friendship with a woman called Liz Bernays, who at the time was a faculty member at Berkeley and then came out here to head entomology. And she is an amazing, amazing ant expert. And then Carl had this very talented graduate student named Karen Jepson. One of her contributions is the grasshoppers found on this ranch and adjacent areas. So he then undertook grasshopper monitoring, and that's a precious skill. And last but not least, one of our undergraduate research assistants from Boulder named Blake Audsley added in upland, especially snakes and lizards, to the project, and so we have some long-term data, but not very many on them. The fieldwork here, I can honestly say, was rigorous. It was intellectually and physically challenging. And one of the things we knew quickly was you analyze your data as you go. There's nothing like a 5-year study and you have garbage as a result because you weren't careful, you didn't measure the right things, etc. When you start field work anywhere, if you're 19th century natural historians, ecologists like Carl and me, it takes several years before you really know the place. Once you know the place, then the fun begins. Then you say, gee, why is that here? Or why isn't that here? And those studies I like to call serendipity. They raise problems that are so much fun to work on and so full of surprises. And to be honest, they're often fundable and they're almost always publishable. Well, the field work was rigorous and we needed a lot of help. For 3 times we had Earthwatch teams, and they were very good at collecting great quantities of data, but they weren't skilled biologists, and we soon had to shift from that to graduate students and undergraduates who were biology majors and visiting faculty who brought their own students or government researchers. And the expertise came from University of California, Michigan, Harvard, University of Colorado, our place, Colorado State University, Northern Arizona, Utah, Utah State, ASU, and especially the University of Arizona. What a precious connection that has been through time. And just when we were sort of overwhelmed by things, and Ariel became very worried about guaranteeing the future of this place because her heart and soul was so embedded here, she started looking toward National Audubon Society. And at that time, a man called Elvis Starr, who had been president of the University of Indiana, and a man called Donald O'Brien were very prominent in Audubon. They understood it immediately, were very helpful, and eased that transition so that we felt much more secure about the future. Carl and I became research directors of the ranch in 1980 and did that for a decade until 1990, and there were always resident managers here. And after that, a director, manager, scientist took over the place, although we and all of our colleagues continued to do work here. Things got a little overwhelming once or twice, and it's as if there were a plan to make our lives work. There were 2 fellows. One was the forest supervisor of Coronado named Bob Tippecanock, and the other one was the head of the Arizona BLM named Dean Bibles. They helped us, encouraged us, were kind to us in so many ways I can't describe them all. And by the way, they also were great firefighters, along with the White Mountain Apache hotshots, and that was the level of their involvement with us. So the insurance for the future of the ranch was in place from 1980 on, and what's wonderful to think about is that the place down to this day is directed with such skill by Linda Kennedy and her many friends, and that rascal she's married to. And I want to conclude my talk just with some photos. I didn't want to include them in the talk, but Carl will talk to you about serendipity, not about all the papers. There's over 50 that we publish from here, or the books, or any of that stuff, but the most, perhaps the most relevant study that we've done here. This is Ariel Appleton, and our daughter, who was 3 years old, she will be 40 now. And I said all the livestock were removed. Well, the Hereford that Laura Bock Hernandez is sitting on is called Baby. And Ariel couldn't part with Baby because she delivered Baby. Her mother died giving birth. Ariel, using a steak knife, and it was sterilized with a bottle of vodka, did a cesarean section on Baby's birth canal and brought out that little calf. And then Baby's last calf at the age of 19 is there also. That's Peaches. So they stayed here. Baby lived to be 25. We thought maybe she was a record Hereford almost. And that's Ariel's beloved Bolson tortoise, Gertie. She did an endangered species project that is surviving now in New Mexico on Ted Turner's ranch. That's Wes Ferguson from the Tree Ring Lab. We were aging the trees at the above Post Canyon. That's Carl. He had a grad student. I dearly loved her too, from Philadelphia, and she didn't know anything. Her husband foolishly bought her a pickup truck to come down here, and she developed this theory that if you drove really fast on a bumpy road, it wouldn't get stuck. And I don't know how many times I saw my husband with the Philadelphian wringing her hands. That's Carl and one of his grad students, Larry Lepstein, on a early mammal line. This is an Earthwatch team. Carl used them as bird dogs. He's there in the middle with the cowboy hat, and the bird dogs are simply walking across this field and flushing birds, and the expert there is identifying them, and Helpful Jane is recording the data. This is Ann Fernald, Dr. Ann Fernald, that's at the University of Tulsa, and she was one of my students here and has continued through her brother to have interest in the place. This is a team of visiting Russians. The man with the white hair who's kneeling, I'm handing him or something or showing him a picture of something. This was in bad times in Russia. And that man's name is Alexei Skvortsov. He's dead now, the world's expert on willows. And we happen to have on the ranch a very rare willow that's mostly found in Mexico, Salix taxifolia. And he wept to see it because there was no way he could go to Mexico. They had to call in twice a day to say where they were. That's some of the Russians. Again, lovely people. I love this picture just to show you some glories of this place. That's a sycamore, and two of my students are playing monkey. And this is Bill Kinney, who did, my student, who did his thesis on some plants here, and he said, okay, it's really hot here. He was from back east, and what he wanted to wear was that T-shirt and those cutoffs, and I made him wear snake leggings, and he whined and carried on. But he did his thesis on Bacchus tyrannoides, which one of the Forest Service people pointed out to me during the dead season, or the dry season, is one of the rare first-rate sources of vitamin A for wildlife and cattle. And now I want to talk about some manipulation we did. Carl and I met at a field station in California and studied fire together as our first joint research, even though it was not the thesis of either of us. This is Rick Lavin and Phil Omi from Colorado State University, leading fire ecologists and authors about fire ecology, and we did set some fires. That's Jeff Mitten and somebody in Finley Tank. He was interested in some of the rare species. And that's Hobart Smith. Hobart Smith is still alive. He's in his 90s. He's not doing field work anymore. He is the most, I think the most distinguished, but I better not say that. I'll say the most published living herpetologist. He's published well over 2,000 papers and well over 45 books, primarily about the herpetofauna of Texas, and of Mexico. And if you look at his left arm, it's swollen. That's what happens when you were bit by a Mojave rattlesnake about 5 days earlier. Hobart was back collecting snakes as soon as he got out of the hospital. And that's Blake Audsley, who looks so silly in that picture. He's the young man who did the snakes and lizards and so on and added them to our monitoring. He then went on to Johns Hopkins University and got an advanced degree in not exactly agricultural economics, it's called international something or other, and in fact hopes to make the world a better place, and I think he'll succeed. And that's Carol, surrounded by a bunch of students and field helpers, and they're talking about what they've learned that day, and they're talking about some surprises, and they're talking about serendipity. And Carl Bock will now have some things to say to you.